The collapse begins quietly. They didn't even say thank you. 18 years. 18 years of arriving first, leaving last, of carrying their chaos, cleaning their messes, reading between the lines no one else could see. 18 years of loyalty until loyalty became a liability. And still no handshake, no farewell lunch, no plaque. Just a folder slid across a polished table, one sheet of paper, one line that said, "We appreciate your service. Effective immediately, your retirement begins." They called it a restructuring. I called it a slow assassination. I remember the air in that room, it didn't move. Like even the oxygen knew better than to breathe too loud. I stared at the man across from me, his tie too tight, his mouth too soft. He used to ask for my help to write his emails. Now he was holding the knife. What brought me here? I wasn't always someone they could discard. There was a time they needed me. I was the one who knew every client's birthday by heart, who could pull performance reports out of thin air, who rewrote proposals at midnight so they would shine by morning. I was the backbone they leaned on when the company was a toddler trembling through its first steps. But when something grows, it forgets its roots. They stopped seeing me after year 12, I think. When younger men with louder voices started walking in, tossing their jackets over chairs, I'd kept warm for a decade. When ideas I'd nurtured were repeated back to me with new names and new owners. I became the dependable one, which is corporate for invisible. Every time they passed me over for promotion, they patted my shoulder like I should be grateful. "You're the glue around here." No one ever promotes the glue. And then the new director came in, young, ambitious, terrified of being outshined. She called it a culture refresh. I called it a purge. She smiled too much when she talked about legacy staff. She meant people like me. You don't notice the beginning of the end while it's happening. It creeps in slow and quiet like a draft under a locked door. At first it was small things meetings. I was no longer invited to projects I'd nurtured, quietly handed off to men with fresher faces and louder ties. I'd walk by conference rooms I used to sit in and see my strategies up on whiteboards, spoken as if born from someone else's brilliance. They didn't steal credit all at once. They just slowly stopped giving it. One morning, a junior staffer asked me where I kept the supply closet key. I'd held the keys to 6 departments, but that was the one they remembered. I laughed politely. Then I cried in the bathroom stall, twice. There's something about being erased in pieces. It doesn't hurt like a punch. It's slower, a paper cut every day, until one day you're bleeding out and no one notices because you've been so good at pretending you're fine. And I was excellent at pretending. I smiled through performance reviews that were more political than practical. I nodded in meetings while someone read my own pitch back to me with fewer commas and more confidence. I watched my mentees rise, some of them careful enough to acknowledge me, most of them too busy basking in new titles to remember the hands that held them up. I didn't resent their success. I resented being buried under it. The new director, let's call her Madison, because of course it was all polished ambition, fresh from some startup that burned fast and bright like so many of them do. She spoke in LinkedIn quotes, wore power dresses that whispered disruption. She didn't understand the company's heartbeat. She only cared about the optics. And women like me, we're not optics friendly, we're not flashy, we're not content, we're the infrastructure. But Madison didn't want infrastructure. She wanted innovation, which meant rebranding experience as outdated. It wasn't long before my desk was relocated to free up space. Then came the emails, less frequent, less urgent. Then the meetings, less frequent, less included. Then the silence. Silence always comes before the storm. And then the letter? They told me I could choose to retire early with dignity, as if dignity was something they could hand me, as if I hadn't been carrying mine through every humiliation, every stolen credit, every time they addressed a room and looked through me like I was made of air. I walked out of that office on a Thursday, box in my hands, spine intact. They didn't know that in the box was more than framed photos and pens. There was a business plan I'd been building quietly, for years. They never asked what I was doing with my weekends, or where I disappeared to after 6 p.m. That was their first mistake. They thought they were ending my story. They didn't realize I was already writing a new one. I didn't wake up the next day with fire in my bones. No, that's not how it works. I woke up at 6:17 a.m. out of habit, the kind of habit that doesn't die just because a job does. I sat in bed holding a cup of coffee that tasted too bitter, staring at the wall where a diploma used to hang, one I'd taken down the night before. Not out of shame, out of closure. There was no audience to clap, no camera to catch the first spark of rebirth. It was just me in my robe wondering what to do with all the noise that used to be my life. And then I opened the notebook, the one I started 5 years earlier, late one night after another promotion passed me by, the one labeled Someday. Inside were sketches, budgets, product ideas, a service model no one had seen, a brand voice no one had silenced. It was messy and half-baked and full of scribbles that didn't make sense even to me anymore. But it was mine. I flipped through it like I was rereading pieces of a woman I'd forgotten. And I heard her again, that younger version of me, the one who believed she could build something that didn't need permission or approval or a man in a tie to validate it. That woman didn't need a corner office. She needed a chance. So I gave it to her. I started small. I sold everything I didn't need. I moved into a smaller space. I said goodbye to the designer heels that used to walk the halls of that company like armor, and said hello to sneakers that ran between meetings I held in coffee shops and kitchens and borrowed spaces. The business wasn't glamorous. It was quiet at first. Just a handful of clients who remembered the work I'd done before it was buried under someone else's logo. I didn't advertise much. I just showed up consistently, clearly, confidently. And women started finding me. Women like me. Women who had been silent, sidelined, shelved. They didn't want inspiration. They wanted execution. They wanted strategy with soul. And that's what I gave them. The first month I made less than what I used to make in a week. The second month I broke even. By month 6, I turned down 2 investors' men who said they believed in my vision, but still suggested I simplify the message and bring in a male co-founder for optics. They didn't understand. This wasn't just a business, it was a reclamation. Every invoice I sent was a line of poetry. Every strategy deck was a manifesto. Every woman I worked with wasn't just a client, she was another survivor rebuilding something from the ashes of what they took. And then it happened. One of my old company's clients, one of their biggest, reached out to me. They'd heard about what I was building, said they were tired of being treated like checkboxes in someone else's dashboard, said they wanted to work with someone who listened. I didn't smile when I signed them. I didn't celebrate. I just whispered to myself, "You have no idea what you started, Madison." They didn't notice at first. My old company. They kept posting stock photos with hollow captions, kept celebrating innovation while bleeding clients behind the scenes, kept promoting men who couldn't hold a strategy meeting without asking ChatGPT what a funnel was. They didn't see me until they had to. It started with whispers, an account lost here, a project delayed there. Then the boardroom panic began. I saw it unfold piece by piece. Because some of their employees, former colleagues, assistants, interns I'd once mentored, they were now mine. And they told me everything. I didn't ask for revenge, but sometimes revenge writes itself. My business grew, not through noise, through results. While they scrambled to retain what was slipping, I was scaling with precision. While they posted leadership quotes on LinkedIn, I built teams of women who had been told they were too soft, too emotional, too much. Turns out too much is exactly what the market was starving for. 2 years after they forced me out, they invited me back. Not as staff, as a speaker. They were hosting a panel on women in leadership. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. The invitation was polite, polished, full of empty buzzwords. They didn't even realize the irony. They were desperate for relevance, and suddenly I was trending. I didn't decline. I didn't accept either. I forwarded the email to my assistant. She used to intern there. They told her she was too quiet for management. She now runs my operations team. She replied with one sentence, "Thank you for your interest. Unfortunately, her calendar is full with things that matter." I don't wake up with bitterness in my mouth anymore. It left me when I realized I didn't need closure. I didn't need them to say sorry. I didn't need them to recognize what they'd lost. I didn't need to burn the building down. I just had to build something taller. And I did. Not in spite of what they did, but because of it. They cleared the path by pushing me off it. So now when women ask me how I did it, how I started over, how I rebuilt, how I made peace with the unfairness of it all, I don't give them some motivational nonsense. I tell them the truth. I didn't rise because I was brave. I rose because I had no choice, because I was tired of handing my brilliance to people who couldn't even see it, and because there is no better revenge than living well with your name on the door they thought you'd never open. Power doesn't feel like a headline. It feels like waking up on your own time, pouring coffee into your favorite chipped mug, opening a laptop with your name etched in the footer of every document. It feels like no longer asking for space because you built the room. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to shrink to be tolerated. I didn't have to soften my voice, blur my brilliance, laugh at jokes that weren't funny just to keep my seat at someone else's table. I made my own table, and women pulled up chairs. And we didn't talk about dress codes or synergy or office politics. We talked about legacy, ownership, liberation. You see, when you've been broken by a system, you don't fix it, you replace it. And that's what we did. There's a moment I come back to often. The moment my business hit its first 7 figures. I was sitting in the back of a cab, no fireworks, no champagne, just a number on a screen. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. Not because of the money, but because I remembered the girl who once skipped lunch for a week to afford a secondhand blazer for her first big meeting. The girl who used to say sorry before every sentence, who stayed late without pay just to prove she belonged. I wish I could go back and hold her, not to tell her it gets better, but to tell her she gets braver. That the same world that ignored her, dismissed her, patronized her, she would one day walk through it with quiet thunder in her step. There's a myth they sell us that reinvention is glamorous, but the truth, reinvention is grief. You mourn the version of yourself that played by the rules, the one who believed that if she just worked hard enough, they'd see her. You bury her slowly, with love, with rage. And then one day you wake up and realize, you didn't lose anything, they did. They lost the woman who would have carried them further than they deserved. They lost the fire they mistook for a flicker. They lost the storm they tried to contain in a box marked HR retirement package. I still walk by their building sometimes. It's taller than I remember, but somehow smaller. I don't feel hate when I see it. I don't feel regret. I feel nothing. And maybe that's the truest form of freedom. To look at what once broke you and not feel the need to break it back. Healing didn't come like a sunrise. It came in fragments like light filtering through blinds in a quiet room I didn't know I owned. It came in slow rituals I built for myself, like scaffolding around a heart that had been dismantled piece by piece. At first, it was the smallest things. I started lighting a candle before opening my laptop, not for any reason except to remind myself that this work was sacred, that my time, my ideas, my energy, they weren't utilities to be extracted anymore. They were offerings, to myself, to the future I was building. I created boundaries where I once built bridges. I said no without softening the edges. And then I started saying yes to rest, to stillness, to walking in the middle of the day without guilt scraping at my heels. No one talks about the grief of not being needed. When I left that job, there was a silence I hadn't prepared for. No more 6 a.m. Slack messages. No more last-minute crises disguised as quick favors. No more being the one who held everything together just so no one else would have to. At first, it felt like abandonment. Then I realized I had confused usefulness with worth. I had made a home inside other people's expectations. But a cage is not a home even if you decorate it with praise. So I burned it. I began building new habits not for efficiency, but for wholeness. I journaled not to track progress, but to hear my own voice again. I planted herbs in my kitchen windowsill, not for cooking, but because I needed to remember I could make things grow. I got a dog, a rescue like me. He didn't care about titles. He cared about walks, about sun patches on the floor, about showing up for belly rubs always on time. He taught me that presence is power. It took me longer to unlearn than to rebuild. To unlearn that my ideas didn't need a man's nod to matter. To unlearn that silence doesn't mean safety. To unlearn the reflex of smiling when I wanted to scream. Sometimes I'd find myself still apologizing, still making myself smaller. Until one day in the middle of a client meeting, I caught myself doing it. I paused, took a breath, then said, actually, no, I don't agree. And just like that, I reclaimed another inch of myself. You don't rise all at once. You rise in the grocery store when you no longer avoid eye contact with the woman who replaced you. You rise when you delete the number you used to call just to feel seen. You rise when you stop needing closure from people who couldn't even give you clarity. You rise when your silence becomes a boundary instead of a punishment. And one day you look around and realize, you are no longer surviving. You are building. You are blooming. You are free. I didn't set out to become a mentor. I didn't want to be anyone's guide. Not at first. When you've just climbed out of your own wreckage, the last thing you think about is leading someone else. But then came the emails, not from investors, not from media, from women, whispers at first, then waves. I saw your name on that project. How did you start over? They forced me out too. I don't know who I am without the title. They said I was too emotional to lead, but your story made me feel less alone. At first I answered each one with care like fragile glass. Then I realized they weren't fragile. They were just told they were. Like I had been. So I began to gather them, not formally, not as a coach or a boss, just as a woman who had walked the fire and made it out with her voice intact. We met in rented spaces, in living rooms, on Zoom calls where kids screamed in the background and cameras shook. They didn't need polish, they needed permission. Permission to grieve what they lost, permission to rage without apology, permission to rebuild without waiting for someone to hand them blueprints. I didn't give them answers, I gave them mirrors. I asked them what they loved before the world told them what to be. I asked them what they would create if they were never again interrupted. I asked them who they'd be if they stopped trying to be digestible. And one by one they answered. There's a woman named Sarah, former VP, forced out after maternity leave. She started a consulting firm that now employs 15 single moms. There's Devin, brilliant neurodivergent, fired for not being team culture. She now designs accessibility systems for major tech companies. There's Layla, my former assistant. She now runs her own agency. Sometimes she calls me at night just to tell me how she handled a client who tried to undermine her. She always ends the call with, "You be proud." And I always answer, "I am. This isn't about me anymore." It never really was. It's about what happens when one woman rises and doesn't pull the ladder up behind her. It's about what shifts when we stop asking for seats and start building entire rooms. It's about legacy, not the kind written in headlines, but the kind that lives in every woman who stopped apologizing and started owning the room she walks into. Sometimes I'm asked if I'd ever go back to the corporate world, back to the meetings and titles and structured stability. And I smile, because there's nothing back there for me. Not anymore. I'm not the same woman they let go. That woman was obedient, loyal, careful. I'm none of those things now. I'm dangerous. I'm free. It took me years to understand that success isn't loud. It's not champagne towers or feature articles or viral applause. It's not the moment you make more money than they ever paid you. It's not even when your business wins the client they thought they'd own forever. Success is quieter than that. It's walking into a room and no longer shrinking. It's no longer over-explaining your worth. It's choosing rest without guilt. It's being trusted with another woman's story because she knows you won't flinch at the broken parts. That's the real victory, not revenge. Recognition, not from them, from yourself. I visited my old office building one last time. Not to prove anything, not to make a statement. Just to see if it still held the power I once gave it. It didn't. It looked smaller than I remembered, like the walls had exhaled after all the pretending left. There was a new name on the door now, some rebrand, some reorg, another face replacing a dozen forgotten ones. I walked by the receptionist desk where I once stood nervously on my first day in heels that blistered. I smiled. Not bitterly, not triumphantly, just calmly. Because the girl who walked in here 18 years ago thinking she had to earn love through labor, she's gone, and the woman I am now. She doesn't ask for rooms to open for her, she builds the building. They never saw it coming. They never thought the quiet one would rise. That the woman they pushed out with a signature and a severance would rise from the rubble with fire in her lungs and bricks in her hands. Not to throw, but to build. This isn't just a story about revenge. It's about reclamation. It's about what happens when a woman stops begging to be chosen and starts choosing herself. It's about what's possible when silence ends, not in screaming, but in strategy. And in the end, it wasn't about crushing them. They were never the destination, just the detour. If I could write her a letter. The woman I used to be, the one packing up her desk with trembling hands and too many unspoken words. I'd tell her, "You didn't fail. They just couldn't hold someone like you." I'd tell her that the grief she feels isn't just about a job. It's about being erased. It's about watching years of care and loyalty get folded into someone else's PowerPoint. It's about loving a place that never really loved you back. But I'd also tell her this is not the end. This is the unbecoming. This is the part where everything she thought she needed falls away like dead leaves and something wilder, deeper, more dangerous begins to grow. No one teaches women how to handle success that doesn't come through permission. We're taught to smile through discomfort, to earn affection through usefulness, to serve support stay small. So when we finally choose ourselves fully unapologetically, it shakes everything. People retreat, systems crack, and we stand in the ruins not as victims but as architects. I didn't just rebuild a career, I reclaimed a self. A woman who no longer edits herself to fit the frame. A woman who doesn't flinch when they call her too much. A woman who leads not from a podium, but from presence. There's a calm that lives in me now. Not because the world became kinder, but because I did. To myself. I stopped chasing closure from people who benefited from my silence. I stopped rereading the emails that once made me question my sanity. I stopped explaining the fire in my voice. Some things don't need to be healed, they need to be honored. And my rage, it was holy. To the woman listening right now, yes, you, the one who stayed too long, who gave too much, who wonders if she has anything left. Let me say this as clearly as I can. You are not disposable. You are not late. You are not broken. They didn't destroy you. They revealed you. And now, you build. Yeah, fade to black, soft breath, one last line. They handed me an exit. I turned it into an entrance. And I walked through on my own terms.